Welcome everybody to the December edition of Mytech U, a monthly educational series for technology and business topics. My name is Stephanie Kingsleen and I will be your moderator today. And this month we're going to be discussing how productivity is built on system uptime and availability. We are fortunate to have Nathan Austin, our VP of Business Development here at Mytech, who will lead us through this topic today. But before we turn the presentation over to Nathan, just a couple notes for the audience. First of all, thank you for joining us today. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available 24 hours after the presentation. The audience is currently on mute, but if you do have questions, please use the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel and we'll do our best to interject your question into the conversation or we'll follow up with you afterwards. With that being said, Nathan, thank you again for this presentation today, and please go ahead and introduce yourself and lead us through.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Stephanie mentioned I'm Nathan Austin. Basically, I work with the sales and marketing team is really what my role here at Mytech is, and I'm excited that this is the first session. This is the first quarter that we're wrapping up a new theme that we've been working on, where every quarter we're going to make sure that we hit on what are the best practices that we've found that deliver success and positive results for our clients. So not just talking about a particular technology, but talking about it in a way that's kind of best practices. And so that's what today is going to be about. Is yes, it's about productivity being built on system uptime availability, but we're really going to be talking about disaster recovery and business continuity. So in order to do that, we need to start with some key terms. So we're going to start with a few key terms to begin with so that we all can have our heads in the right place as we walk through the rest of these concepts. So first and foremost, there is a difference between business continuity and disaster recovery. So this is very oftentimes confused, and sometimes these words or these phrases are used synonymously, where people refer to business continuity and what they really mean is disaster recovery and vice versa. So for the sake of this conversation, I think it's important that that we cover a generally accepted and understood definition of these respective terms. So I'm not going to read that to you, but basically business continuity is encompassing the entire business's ability to return to an operational state. So that's not just technology that we're going to be focused on today, but the entirety. There are organizations that focus on this that also talk about communication trees. You know, hopefully your business continuity plan isn't in the building that just caught fire. So how do you make sure you have copies of those things off-site? So there's a bunch of things that business continuity is around the entirety of restoring your business to a normal operational state, or at least to an operational state. Then disaster recovery is specifically referring to the technology components that support the business to get back to productivity. So kind of the last section there that's highlighted is disaster recovery is then a subset of business continuity. So typically when folks in this industry refer to business continuity, they are encompassing disaster recovery, but for the sake of today, we're going to be talking about continuity of things you can do to enable your business to continue even through a failure, as it notes, and then what can you do to prepare yourself when there is a disaster or is a failure that where actually production stops. So those are a couple key terms, couple sources there for those that are interested. Guys, thank you Wikipedia for the nice definitions. The other thing that I think is important about when we talk about disaster recovery is that redundancy, the investments in redundancy and recovery provide basically no return on investment until the day you need them. And I hope for all of our sakes that you never do, because that means that we're in a bad place and we're in a firefighting place, and that's not a place that people normally want to operate. But it's important to understand that it's difficult to calculate return on investment, because if you don't ever use the redundancy that you invested in, or if you don't ever use some of these components of the backups, there is no return. So I think it's important to understand that that's not the objective of this conversation. It's really about enabling your business to continue and mitigating the risk of loss. And secondly, moving on, another key concept that is really a theme woven throughout any type of business continuity or disaster recovery conversation is this concept of N+1. Is if you've got some production thing that's critical, well, how do you have a +1 on that to mitigate against the primary production failing or having a problem? I do want to specify, last month our webinar was a panel discussion with individuals who have been in the industry a long time or just been in business a long time, and they told some of the horror stories that they had and how they approach business continuity. And one of the things I thought was interesting that was unexpected was that 2 of the 3 panelists actually talked about the N+1 wasn't just about some piece of equipment or technology. It was also about mitigating the risk of personnel who might hold a key position and how can you mitigate that risk of winning the lottery or something like that happening to one of their personnel. So I think that was an important concept, that this doesn't just apply to your technology. That's what we're going to focus on today. But when you think about continuity, it applies to all areas of your business. Okay, with those things covered, now that we kind of have our heads in the right place and understanding some key concepts, let's dig into some of the things we're going to cover today. Here's a high level. We believe that by following some of these best practices, not some of the best practices, by following all of these best practices, and by following that, we have a value map that we use to make recommendations, that by following the value map, that our clients receive 4 times more productivity and value from their technology investment. And we believe this applies to the disaster recovery and business continuity components as well. We're going to cover some simple and low-cost investments that you can make to provide some extra continuity and redundancy, as well as then some details that sometimes are just overlooked, but can be really easy components to implement to mitigate risk. Okay, so really what we're trying to talk about here is, in the first section is, look, there are known issues that technology has. There are known problems. So if we know that these problems exist, what can we do to prepare for them in advance? So for instance, things like power outages. I'm sure those folks on the phone, you've never experienced a power outage, you've never experienced an internet outage. I'm sure we've all done that. These things happen, so there's things you can do about them. Hardware failures happen. Equipment, anything that has a fan, anything that's got an operating system, anything that ages from a piece of equipment perspective will have failures. So knowing that this happens, how can you mitigate against it? So that's some of the key things we're going to talk about in the first section. Stephanie, I want to pause. Any thoughts or comments or clarifying questions?
Not at the moment. I think for the listeners, I think you had mentioned last month's Mytech U, and I think it'd be really beneficial to kind of listen to that. It will go, a lot deeper into some of those situations that you were talking about, where some are pretty obvious, like the ones you have up here, and then I'm sure what you're going to get into soon, the ones that are maybe not so obvious. So I would encourage people to go ahead and listen to that one as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. It actually is. Those 3 panelists were telling their stories. They're kind of their horror stories, and then lesson learns from those horror stories. So I know I learned a lot and enjoyed the conversation as well. So yeah, that's a good tip.
And even like you were saying, you were talking about winning the lottery as being one of the continuity things. Even a couple of them, it was something as simple as so that they could take vacations. That they're not the primary contact, so that they could actually take time with their families and go on a vacation.
Yeah, that's a great point. Exactly. It's not just sometimes it's just the mundane as opposed to the extravagant or the anomaly. Yeah. Thank you. Moving on to talking about power. One of the things that I did some research in preparing for this conversation, and if those of you who came to our in-person event in October, we did touch on a couple of these points. But I love this because this is kind of our expectation. This is our expectation of power. And from our experience, it's also what people expect of their technology. They want to be able to flip that switch, and it's just kind of this given that it's going to work, of course, except when it doesn't. So that's why I love that quote, because really we were talking about electricity, but I think that also applies very much in the technology space for all of our staff and people that we work with. There's some interesting tidbits and data that I pulled up, and there's the source for that. But I'll just pause for those that are listening. I'm not going to ask you to answer the question, but just in your head, think about any guesses on how many minutes per year is the national average for power outages that people experience? Pause, give you a moment to think. The answer is around 200 minutes. So, you get different blips and you get different storms that come through. And one of the reasons why we did this in Q4 is because if you're in Minnesota or Colorado, and snowstorms happen, power outages happen because of snowstorms or ice storms, things like that. So this is something that's pertinent and timely. At least we hope that doesn't hit you, but of course it does happen on average 200 minutes a year nationally. So Colorado actually has a little bit lower national average at 114 minutes annually, but in Minnesota though, I put this up here because it's actually more. It's nearly double the national average if your organization or you live in Minnesota. So for the Coloradans that are listening, congrats. You don't have to worry about this as much, but for Minnesota, bad news, it hits you a little harder. So, but put in that perspective, one of the things that we like to be able to do is tell some actual stories of some of the power outages that we've experienced from some clients. One of our clients, this was many years ago, Minnesota got hit with a pretty severe ice storm. And one client in particular, they happened to be in an area where they were out of power for, I think it was 5 or 6 days. It was at least 4 days, but I think it was 5 or 6 days, and their business was completely down. Now they had all of their equipment was in their building, and there was really nothing that they could do at the time. So now there are things that this business is doing to mitigate against that by moving things to a hosted environment and having a more mobile plan. But at the time they didn't, and they get hit with an ice storm, power outage, totally out of business for several days. Many of you, this was national news back, I think in 2010, if I remember correctly, maybe 2011, where Minnesota got so much snow, it was almost 2 feet of snow, and it actually collapsed the Metrodome in downtown Minneapolis. That was a storm that took probably a week for roads to get back to normal, our staff to be able to get to work, as well as then be able to our clients to have their employees back to work as well. So sometimes this one didn't cause as many power outages that we experienced. It was just the sheer volume of snow created an obstacle that was difficult to get around as far as getting back to production. And then another one that was an example that Mytech experienced in Colorado is that there was some construction going on down the street from our office building, and the construction crews, I use a crane hitting a power lines. I don't know if it was a crane hitting power lines or if it was a backhoe digging up a cable. I'm not sure which, but nonetheless, we experienced the power just because of construction going on down the street. So those are real examples that we've experienced or our clients have experienced with regard to power. And so these things happen. So what can we do about them? So let's talk about the overlooked details. Well, one, not everyone knows that a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply, you can increase the runtime by just adding a battery. So there's actually some calculations you can do where if you say you've got all the equipment that's if you have it in your equipment on premise in your office, when we have all that equipment plugged in, you can actually say, all right, well, how much runtime do I have if this lost power? It can actually tell you if you have a smart UPS. And you can then say, all right, well, if I just add a battery, you can just add more runtime. So one of our clients that we worked with said they had a requirement. They wanted to have all of their core infrastructure and critical systems run for an hour in the event of a power outage. So we scaled and just added a couple extra batteries, and that got them an hour of runtime for their critical systems, servers, internet, phone lines. Now their desktops didn't have power, but all laptop users did. So if you want to do something that'll run desktops, that's another different scenario, but oftentimes this is a simple thing you can do of just adding a battery to get some extra runtime if you'd like. Secondly, we do recommend especially if you own your building, invest in a generator. And the other thing that's important is test it quarterly or biannually. Or if you don't own your building, engage your property manager to have a plan. What is their plan in the event of a power outage that could be sustained? Do they have a backup generator? Do they have any kind of plan, or are they just at the whim of the power companies? So that's something to consider. And then the other thing is that even if you have a UPS battery, if you don't keep it in good condition and keep it less than 5 years old, you could be at the point where you have a power outage and your battery is not able to actually do what it does, because we all know things with batteries, laptops, cell phones, etc. The more you use the battery, the longer that battery goes on, the less life it has in it. Excuse me, the less life it has in it. So one of the things you can do, and I didn't put it on here as a note, but UPSs and the ones that we recommend have a little network card in them that can actually send alerts so that we know when the battery is not working well. It'll tell us actually proactively. And a lot of times the battery life depends on the kind of the clean power that you have or lack of clean power you have in your building. So you can't necessarily depend on a battery always lasting 3 years or 5 years because it really depends on its use. So anyway, but keeping in good condition, having a network card that alerts on that, we can make sure that you don't have these kinds of issues that can cause significant outages for your business. Okay, that's the power section. Any thoughts, comments, questions, Stephanie?
No, looks good.
Feel good? All right. I know sometimes I don't pause as much, so I want to make sure I pause and give you or the folks to ask a question. Again, for those who just joined, I see some extra people joined here. You can use the question panel in the GoToMeetings tool panel, and if you have any questions. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to make a real profound statement. Our businesses depend on the internet. Well, one of the things that many people haven't considered when we've had this kind of conversation is how long, and I think, Stephanie, do we have a poll built in?
I believe so, yeah.
We didn't, that's all right. Did we build one out? I can't remember.
Nope.
Forgive me,
don't
everyone.
have it this time.
Nope, we didn't. Okay, so sorry. But basically, again, think about it yourself. Internally, kind of think to yourself, well, how long can your business last without the internet? Is it 5 minutes? Is it an hour? What functions are affected? I mean, depending on if you have everything local, if you have a lot of remote people that are disconnected, well, what are some things? How is that going to impact your business? So, and then of course, whenever you talk about the internet, I always think about our Abe Lincoln, because he was around the internet times. Honest Dave there, everything on the internet's true. Sorry, I don't know why I find that funny, but so let's tell some stories that there were some recent incidences around internet connectivity or telecom connectivity. So just recently, there's actually a major outage affecting national internet carriers, CenturyLink and 3. They've been going through an acquisition. I don't know if that was the reason why, but it affected people all across the country that had any connectivity to their services. That was anything that we did. That wasn't anything that we could have done anything about, but it affected us. The only thing that we can do is mitigate against this. We're going to talk about a little bit later, just the next slide. We also had 2 clients recently in Minnesota, both of whom were going through switching out their internet service providers. And in doing so, there was a miscommunication or timing wasn't exactly right, where services were shut off before the new services were put into production. So for any of you going through that, because it's a common thing to optimize your bandwidth, to optimize your billing as your business needs change. But as you're making these kinds of changes, I would recommend please involve us, because we can help mitigate some of this stuff. But as well as know that a simple thing like shutting it off affected both of these clients pretty dramatically, and that was they were down for several hours, each of them were. Again, nothing that was really their fault per se. It was really the miscommunication of the provider. And then I like this. For those, I'm aging myself here a little bit from Airplane, the movie. Mytech's Colorado office actually had, shortly after we had done some expansion in that office, our internet was down, and we couldn't figure out why. And it was actually before we had gotten a second internet connection in there, but it was physically unplugged. Someone, intentionally or unintentionally, we don't know, in the main building's data closet, where every tenant in the building's internet connection came through there, it was just physically unplugged. No idea how it happened, but it was just, I imagine a person like this unplugging, just kind of unplugging it just to see what might happen. But those are things that, happen. And so hopefully they don't happen often, but they do happen. So what can you do about it? Well, one of the simplest things you can do is invest in a secondary, and I say, or tertiary internet connection. We actually have 3 internet connections that come into our facility here in Minnesota. We use it for various connections. We have one connection that goes right to our data center, and we have 2 internet connections that we use as well for backup VPNs, just backup connectivity to our Colorado office, et cetera. So the other thing that we strongly recommend for clients is that sometimes they feel like, well, but if I just have a second one, I'm just going to pay for it and not use it. Well, we actually recommend that you use it, because if you have any on-premise infrastructure, the secondary internet connection is a great one to use for just sending your data backups offsite on a regular basis. So, and then if in the event of a primary failure, you can actually fail over to that one, no problem, and it won't, and we can slow down or turn off the backups when that happens, the offsite component. Have a remote work plan. This is something that in the event of some sort of outage might affect your office. See if you can enable people to work from home. What are the things that can be done that are critical functions that might not be dependent on your office? A course, that only works for functions that are not in the facility experiencing the outage, but there's definitely lots of ways around that, as long as you kind of have a thought through it and put a plan in place. And then similarly, plan to move essential services or functions to an outside environment, such as email, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, some of the service as a service options that are available that can enable you to work from anywhere without being dependent upon the internet connection at your physical office. You could go down to the local coffee shop, connect to their internet, or go home, connect to your internet, and still be able to be productive. So those are definitely things that play into what you can do for internet. And usually a secondary internet's not that expensive to be able to do to mitigate the risks that you can encounter. And for all the, we're definitely techie nerds, geeks here, and the new Star Wars movie just came out, so couldn't help but throwing a little Obi-Wan in there. So, all right, well, let's not forget about the firewall. This is definitely one of the most overlooked components. So the firewall, again, I know I'm stating the obvious here, all internet traffic flows through the firewall. Problem is, most organizations only have a single firewall. The good news is that firewalls don't fail very often, but they still are a piece of equipment that has moving parts and has heat and has electricity that fails. So what are some things that go through it? Your email, that's primary, your security, hosted applications, if you do web or video conferencing, remote sites, voice over IP phones, and of course the dreaded Facebook and LinkedIn. So let's tell a couple stories that we've actually had happen to some clients to kind of illustrate the point. This is we just upgraded from this phone system last year. No, that's definitely not true. But we actually had one of the clients that we had a voice over IP problem that they had to make some rule changes to the firewall. And the problem is, because of all the other traffic going on, they couldn't reboot the firewall in the middle of the day because it was their only firewall that had all that other stuff that we just talked about flowing through it. So they ended up having to wait till the end of the day to reboot the firewall, which solved the problem, but they had to live with the problem for several hours while they were waiting till the end of the day to happen. One of the things you can do with firewall is if you have a redundant there, you can actually reboot it and it won't cause that disruption. We'll talk about that in a second. So that was actually a real example of a client that couldn't reboot. And that's actually one of the reasons why we use that as an example is because oftentimes when people think about redundancy at the firewall, they only think about the firewall dying, which doesn't happen that often. It does, it just doesn't happen that often. This is the more often scenario, especially if you have remote offices or if you have hosted services, where you might need to make a change that's impacting productivity or the production environment, and you don't want to make that change because it's going to affect everything in the organization. Well, having some redundancy there can mitigate that risk. The other story is we actually had a client that did have a hardware failure in their firewall. The firewall froze up, died. They are susceptible to power surges, things like that. And fortunately, the good news is we actually did have a spare in our office that fit them, because we don't keep every kind of spare of firewall around because they're expensive, and as soon as you get them, you want to keep them up to date. So we had one, but the problem is their office was on the other side of the mountain range in Colorado. So we actually had to drive several hours to get there. So they were down that whole time because, again, we had the spare, so that's good. So that could have been a problem, but we did. But then just the time to drive there was significant. So the impact that they had was definitely more than that of just building in some simple redundancy. So what can you do for firewalls? So common things that are a theme among equipment, right? Keep it less than 5 years old. That's important. That way you're mitigating against the risk of increased probability of failure as the equipment ages. Maintain your the subscription. Typically, firewalls have security, subscription, and warranty tied together. Maintain those so you can get replacements in the event of some sort of problem. So that's always good. And the last one is, we strongly recommend this, is investing in a high availability solution. So that's what we call HA, or high availability. So really what that means, and this graphic is a simple one I could find, is basically you have two physical firewalls. And we work with SonicWall. And one of the things we really love about SonicWall is the way they do their high availability. They do, not only is it make it so that you can reboot the firewall in the middle of the day and it doesn't impact a single thing. If you had a phone call going, if you had a video you're streaming or web conference you're watching like this one, it wouldn't interrupt at all. And they also make it cheaper for you, whereas a lot of other competitors force you to buy extra services and warranty and support on that secondary unit. They basically say, look, you're already buying, you already have the primary unit, you already have all this support and warranty on it. All you need to now buy is basically cover the cost of the hardware. So they actually make it significantly less expensive to be able to actually implement a solution like this. And especially for all of you who are thinking, if you have, moving things to the cloud in the near future, if you're thinking about moving things to the cloud, having redundancy at the firewall level is critical. And this is a simple way to basically mitigate against a simple failure completely affecting all of your production systems. And that's the firewall side. One last thing about redundancy that seems to be overlooked, don't forget about laptops and desktops. Do you have spares? Now, if you're a smaller organization, you might have to weigh whether or not it makes sense to have a spare sitting around. But I know for our organization, for a lot of our clients, they really look at it as, I don't want to have to wait. If a machine dies, I don't want to have my person down for a day or two or however long it takes to get a new machine in place, get it configured properly for them to get them up and running. So we actually recommend asking yourself this question and understanding that, let's say it takes 48 hours for you to get a new computer in there. Is that something you can live with, or is it something that makes sense for you to keep a spare around? So that's something that's overlooked, but it's important to mention. All right, so now we've covered really a lot of the some of the simple things that are overlooked, but also simple things you can do, like high availability firewall, relatively easy to do. I mean, it's not easy to implement, but it's not that expensive to implement. You talk about redundant internet connections and an extra battery on a UPS. These are not expensive things to do, but they can definitely mitigate against common known outages that happen to everyone on a regular basis. So now we're going to get into a bigger conversation, though. Now we're going to talk the server side, which many people are going hosted. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this applies if you have on-premise equipment versus hosted equipment, because it does apply in both scenarios. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of probably one of the worst, in my memory, one of the worst examples of how random failures and problems were made worse because of some decisions to save a few bucks on the front end. And part of it was, well, candidly, I'll say part of it was my fault because I didn't hold the line enough to say, nah, you really shouldn't do that, even though we recommended, what we're going to talk about here. There are two simple decisions that were made that were seemingly harmless at the time, but they actually had a dramatic impact on this organization's ability to recover. Now, this organization I'm going to describe, not going to say the name, they're no longer in business. They actually sold their practice, but it was a law firm in Minnesota that it was about a 25, 30-person law firm that had this happen to them. So the first decision. So in the process of investing in their infrastructure, we always recommend a 24/7, 4-hour response warranty. It was probably about $300 cheaper to do a 9x5, so basically a regular business day, next business day warranty, which means that you can submit a claim during the regular business hours, but you're not going to get anything till the next business day. So if you have a part that you need, you're not going to get to the next business day. Whereas if you have the 24/7 warranty, I can submit a claim at 7 p.m. and by 11 p.m. I'm going to have that part. And that's the commitment that the manufacturer is making to you if that's what you buy. So that decision ended up causing, and I'll tell you exactly how, it ended up delaying hardware replacement that made this outage last from a Tuesday until a Friday instead of from a Tuesday to a Wednesday. So huge difference. The other decision was and this was several years ago, and we won't because of this experience we actually don't we will not support a backup solution using an external hard drive that's a USB-based hard drive because of this example. Instead of a network attached backup that's actually where you can transfer data via the network. Basically the result was that to do the recovery, because we had to recover the data from the backup, it slowed the data transfer speeds, and it was 5 to 10 times slower, which is hours and hours and hours, again, which contributed to a recovery going from a Tuesday to a Friday instead of from a Tuesday to a Wednesday. So what happened? we had this client had invested in new equipment, and about 9 months or a year into investing in a new equipment. So it's not like they had made some wise investments in buying good equipment. But 9 months to a year, they had some freak things happen. I don't know. We never really found out why they happened. Was it a power surge? Was it overheating? Was it just bad equipment? We're not sure. We don't know. All we know is that what the first issue was showing is a hard drive failure. So their server was down because of a hard drive failure. Now, usually that doesn't happen. So there was indicators that there was other things, but the diagnostics that we were able to run, so this is a Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday midday, was that it was a hard drive. So we initiated a warranty, and of course, there's an next business day warranty, so we got the hard drive Wednesday morning. As we work to get restoring and bring the machine back online, it's not coming back online because it turned out there was actually, in the diagnostics were showing another hard drive failure and another component in the server failing as well. So we had to then initiate another warranty exchange. Of course, this is working with the manufacturers. This is the way they do it. So we had to initiate another warranty exchange replacement, which then, of course, now it's Wednesday morning. Well, now we got to wait till Thursday morning. So now it's an outage just because we had to replace equipment. We're talking Thursday morning. Well, then we started, once we got things back up and running, we started the restore process. Well, the restore process ended up taking, again, 5 to 10 times longer because it was basically transferring over really slow USB connections. So it took hours and hours and hours, and we weren't able to get this client back up and running until about mid-morning, midday on Friday. So it was a full, Tuesday to Wednesday, Wednesday to Thursday. It was a full 3 business days of downtime when if these 2 decisions were made differently, where it didn't save them a whole bunch of money, they probably would have only been down for about a day instead of 3 days. So again, these are, we share these stories not because to say like how right our recommendations or anything like that, because this is why we make these recommendations, and we hope that this stuff never happens to you because this is not a good situation. It was not fun to be in the middle of it. It was not fun to have that postmortem conversation that I had where we had to go through these things and discuss it. But these simple things can save you hours and hours of productivity time, and the difference in dollars here are a few $100s versus the thousands and thousands of billable dollars that they lost in those extra 2 days of downtime. So that said, what can you do? Well, it depends on if you have on-premise or hosted. And as we use the commonly used acronym as infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, if that's how you pronounce it. So let's talk about on-premise first. One, invest in multiple, depending on the size of your organization, invest in multiple physical servers, again, with the N+1 capacity. So one of the things that we look at, the larger organization goes, that basically if you have 2 servers, can one of the servers run your entire environment? If you have 3 servers, can 2 servers run the environment? It's basically understanding, again, the N+1 mentality. If one thing were to fail, are you still able to be in function? Now, if you're a small enough organization where you only have 1 server, that's a physical server, then you really look to the backup, which we're going to talk about next, as far as being able to mitigate that. Again, same message, keep production servers under 24/7 4-hour response warranty. Again, usually the initial warranty is 3 years. Keep it to 5, extend it to 5. And then keep production servers under 5 years of age. So that's important. However long you keep them in production, hopefully no longer than 5 years, because it's actually, there's a lot of data out there that suggests that after 4 years, the server's performance really starts slowing your organization down. But at the 5-year mark, you just run the increased risk of failure, which is going to have a big performance impact, obviously. So there's a strong data to back that up that I'd be happy to share with anyone if you're interested. Also, so let's look over to the hosted server side. So infrastructure as a service, IaaS. One of the things that's nice about that is that it has built-in redundancy. This N+1, they have N+ lots of ones. They have typically in an infrastructure, when you're doing some sort of infrastructure as a service, there's multiple layers of redundancy that you don't have to worry about investing in. But that's the beauty of it, and that's oftentimes why it's difficult to make a apples-to-apples comparison if you're buying a physical infrastructure versus doing infrastructure as a service, is because to really do a comparison of building all the redundancy into stuff you might buy to put in your office, it's going to be a heck of a lot more than what it would be if you're just renting it as an infrastructure as a service. So that's kind of how that works. But you're buying all of that in the $300 a server a month is usually around the ballpark, depending on what you're doing with it. Is you're buying all that redundancy as well, so to mitigate against that hardware failure. The other thing that we would consider when you're talking about servers, because let's say you're a small organization that doesn't have, that only has 1 or 2 servers, and you can't really afford to build this extra redundancy in, well, you can consider what business functions, such as email, for example, that might make sense to send to the cloud or to use in a hosted environment. So you're not having that physical server or that virtual server in your office. So those are some things you can do from a hosted server perspective to mitigate that. But going hosted, you're basically mitigating against some of the common hardware failures anyway. So you're kind of paying for that service. All right. So that's really what we recommend around servers. One last main section to cover. Any questions or comments, Stephanie?
No, not at all. And I'm assuming you're probably going to get to it when you start talking more about like a hybrid environment.
That's a good point. So I didn't talk about that, but I really, for simplicity's sake, I was just talking about the difference between on-premise versus hosted. But we definitely see, to Stephanie's point, we definitely see many organizations that have a combination. So they might have a physical server on-premise, but yet they have some hosted services as well. That's actually a very common transition plan. So you're not necessarily moving everything to a hosted environment all at the same time. We're seeing pieces of functions moving to the cloud. So you're right. Oftentimes your risk mitigation and your backup strategy, which we're going to talk about next, are multifaceted in that you're looking at, well, what do I need to do for my on-premise, and then what do I need to do for my hosted? Because it's rare that we see an organization all or none on either side. Actually. So I think that's what you're alluding to.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good point. Thank you. Okay, so now that we've talked about mitigating the risk of failures, let's talk about backup. I say know before you go, because this is a concept, and I'm going to explain this slide that we like to use because it just tries to really simplify really the business's role in this. Oftentimes we run across IT folks that are charged or tasked with implementing a backup strategy, and they don't have the information, or they haven't been given the information, or they haven't had the dialogue with the business to say, well, these are our business requirements. I want to build a recovery solution that enables us to recover inside of our maximum tolerable downtime, right? Because as a business owner, as a business need or a function serving your clients, fulfilling your purpose, there is a maximum tolerable downtime at which you could start where your business starts getting hurt. So understanding what that is, and it might be different, Stephanie, almost to your point, it might be different based on the different functions. So your on-premise equipment might have a different need for that. Your hosted equipment might have a different need for that. Different functions inside your business might have a different need for that. So, but understanding some key concepts around backup. So I'm going to start with the RPO, so recovery point objective. It basically means how many, back in time, at what point do you want to be able to recover? So on the, I'll try and use my cursor here so you can see that. So on this section here, we actually talk about, well, is this frequency an hour? Is that a day? Is that a week? How far back do you want to, is it 15 minutes? So if you want your recovery point, do you want to be able to recover back to the most recent 15 minutes? Or do I have to go back an hour? Or do I have to go back, think about back in the tape days, which is, not that long ago. That was a day. You had to go back at least a day and sometimes a week. So that's your kind of your recovery point objective, is how far back in time do you need to go? Is it 15 minutes, is it an hour, a day, or what does that look like? And then it's, okay, so now you know what point in time you can recover, but then how fast do you need to recover it? And that is really what the recovery time objective is how fast can I get back into a production environment? So we have different backup solutions that we work with, and we have a conversation like, well, do you need an hour recovery, 4-hour recovery, 8 hours, 24, 48? Like, what's the recovery time? How fast do you need it? I can recover you to the last 15 minutes, but if your server in your office is dead, and how do we recover you? And how fast do you want me to make sure that I, get that back up and running? So that's what recovery time objective is. And then of course the maximum tolerable downtime is really saying, okay, well, if you go beyond the recovery time objective to the point of the business gets really hurt. So you want to have your recovery time objective inside of the maximum tolerable downtime, just at a high level of some of those key concepts. So what can you do for backup then? So let's talk about on-premise versus hosted. And we recommend, again, this is not just us, this is industry standard, is right, saying you have 3 copies of data in at least 2 locations. And the other part is oftentimes people say, well, at least one of them being offline. You definitely want to have it encrypted, cloud or second location. We definitely have clients that if they have multiple locations, they're replicating between sites for their offsite, and that's fine. We have clients that have hosted environments that replicate to their premise and from their premise to the cloud, so they're kind of cross-replicating for those 2 locations to meet that requirement. And definitely an image-based backup that captures all of the application, the operating system, and the data, not just the data. So again, a lot of people get that already, but again, just to state it and have it as part of the conversation. Define your level of RTO. I touched on this already, is really understanding how fast you need to recover. That's really what that means, and that could be different for different systems. The other piece that is often overlooked is know your data retention requirements. If you're in a regulated industry like medical or financial, you typically have a 7 or 10 year requirement that goes on your data. You have to keep your data for 7 or 10 years. If you're not in one of those regulated industries, you might still want to do that, but you might not be required to do it. But a lot of times backup solutions, as part of their cost structure and part of the delivery of meeting your requirements, does depend on what is your data requirement, your data retention requirement. 1 year, 7 years, 10 years, something in between. So know what that is so that your whatever backup you choose actually can meet the requirements. Over on the cloud side, now we're talking cloud to cloud. So you're typically talking about 2 copies, maybe 3 if you replicate back to your on-prem, but oftentimes you're talking from your production environment to a secondary cloud environment. Again, you also have to apply the retention requirement there too. The other thing that's important to note around backup in a hosted environment, like for instance O365, they have a limited backup. So it's only, I can't remember if it's 7 or 30 days, and I think it depends on the plan that you might have, but there's not a lot of backup. So does that meet your requirements? If it doesn't, there are solutions out there that can actually make sure they back that up. And Office 365 is not the only one that this problem applies to. It's just that it's the one that a lot of people know and understand, so they're familiar with. So those are some of the key things that we recommend for doing for backup. Keep those in mind. Simple things, often overlooked components that can definitely, having these answers, you can build a solution that meets all these requirements for you. So finally, I really want to say, look, this is complicated stuff. I tried to boil it down here so that it's something that you could follow or at least kind of check the box, so to speak. But if you'd like to have Mytech work with you to review your business continuity and disaster recovery plans, we'd be happy to kind of walk through and have these conversations with you. Because some of these conversations are not technology problems, these are business problems. But we're happy to help facilitate those as well if that makes sense for you. So by all means, reach out. We'd be happy to have the conversation. We'd love to chat and we'd love to help. So, but before we go, I would like to say we do have a couple upcoming events. I mentioned we had a panel last month. We'll send out the link in our follow-up email on that. But we also have a panel discussion next month where we're actually talking about software as a service. We have panelists that have migrated from different SaaS solutions from one to the other, panelists that have migrated from an on-premise solution to a SaaS environment, and they're going to tell their story. So, and I haven't got it lined up yet, but I'm working to get a SaaS vendor on the call so that they can actually talk about their experience as well. So that's what that panel discussion is going to be, about them telling their story, what did they learn. So hopefully as all of us go through that journey, because most of us will probably go to a SaaS offering at some point in the future, and so this will hopefully be some lesson learned that you can incorporate into your planning. And then the other thing I wouldn't want to forget is we do have an in-person event that's at our respective offices in Minnesota and Colorado at the end of January on the 23rd and 25th respectively, where we are going to be talking about collaboration and communication tools that your team should be using. And you've probably never seen these tools before. These are brand new tools from Microsoft you've never seen, never heard of, not necessarily, but most likely you've never heard of. But we're going to be highlighting them, going over them, and announcing some cool stuff at that event. So we'd love to have you at Colorado or Minnesota at the end of January. And with that said, thank you very much for attending. Stephanie, any final comments or clarifications or things I might have missed in the last section there?
Not at all. Thank you, Nate. That was a really good way to break it down. It made it really easy to follow. So great job.
Well, thank you. And like you said earlier, Stephanie, this will be available online, and we'll send out the link to the recording in the follow-up email. It'll be sent out tomorrow. So, yeah,
and please feel free to share this with colleagues and other people that you think may find it informative. At Mytech, we're all about helping others in business and in technology, so please share it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody.
And, Yeah, have a great day.